She didn't steal it in the shadows, didn't creep through a vault, or slip a jewel into her bag. No, Queen Camilla wore it openly. A pendant so rare it hadn't been seen in public since the reign of Edward VII. A jewel protected under lock and law by Queen Elizabeth herself. And when the royal guards spotted it glittering at her throat, he didn't stay silent. He broke the one rule drilled into him for decades, stepped forward from his line in front of 200 witnesses, and invoked the safeguard every guard hopes he'll never have to use. What happened next didn't just remove Camilla from the hall, it rewrote the very meaning of royal inheritance. Before we show you exactly what happened that day inside Windsor Castle, hit the like button if you believe duty should always outweigh comfort. Subscribe with the bell turned on so you never miss these true stories of silence and discipline. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from right now. Because this wasn't just a theft, it was an insult to the late Queen's memory. The chandeliers of St. George's Hall glowed like constellations, suspended above 1,000 years of stone. Long tables gleamed with polished oak and heavy silver, their surfaces prepared for a diplomatic luncheon that was meant to pass without remark. The faint tap of rain against leaded windows gave the hall a hushed, reverent sound, as though history itself was leaning in to listen. Sergeant Rhys Mallory stood at his post along the west wall, a figure carved from discipline. The scarlet tunic of the Coldstream Guards clung to his frame with ceremonial precision, brass buttons shining under the light. His boots, mirror-polished to black glass, were aligned to the flagstones as though measured with a ruler. And above it all sat the tall black bearskin, its weight pressing down on him with the familiar reminder of duty. He had worn it so many hours that its heaviness no longer distracted him. Instead, it anchored him, grounding every breath he took in the knowledge of where he stood and what he represented. He had been to Afghanistan once, Helmand Province, years ago. A scar along his jawline, nearly hidden by shadow, still marked the place where shrapnel had caught him. But none of that mattered here, in a hall filled with ministers, attachés and servants. Here he was the guard, immovable, silent, impartial. The luncheon was a quiet affair compared to coronations or state banquets. A Nordic trade delegation had been invited for what palace staff called a soft close to a week of meetings. No television cameras, only a single accredited photographer at the far end, his lens strictly limited. The hall hummed with polite voices and the tuning of a string quartet preparing to play from the gallery above. Rhys's eyes scanned the room in their practiced rhythm. He was not watching for gossip or curiosity, he was watching for anomalies. His training told him that most breaches began not with shouting or sudden movements, but with small details, things that didn't quite fit. That was when he noticed the passes. A household aide was rushing along the tables, checking names against the guest list, issuing lanyards to staff who needed access to side corridors. Rhys caught the detail in an instant. Most badges bore the standard crest, but one, just one, carried a faint legacy icon, an insignia reserved for those with clearance to archival wings. This was not a setting where such clearance should appear. The aide moved on quickly, oblivious, but the detail lodged itself in Rhys's mind like a stone in a boot. He shifted no muscle, gave away nothing. Stillness was the rule. Guards did not move until necessity outranked the moment. But behind his calm gaze, he filed the observation away, as he always did, waiting to see what shape the day would take. The string quartet struck its first chord. Silverware aligned itself in quiet expectation, and the doors to the hall prepared to open. The ceremony was in motion. The great oak doors swung inward on their hinges, and every head in St. George's Hall turned as Queen Camilla entered. She did not pause to acknowledge the quartet or the diplomats who rose instinctively to their feet. Instead, she moved with a cool, deliberate grace, the blue silk of her dress flowing against the red carpets as if she were walking on water. The tap of her heels echoed sharp against the hush, each step its own declaration of ownership. But it was not her presence alone that silenced the room. It was what hung from her neck, an emerald, pear-shaped, deep as bottled forest light, nested in a lattice of Victorian gold. The pendant shimmered beneath the chandeliers, a captive star flaring with every motion. Even to the untrained eye, it was not just jewellery, it was heritage. The Lockridge pendant, whispered to have been locked away for generations, unseen since the time of Edward VII. Rhys Mallory saw it immediately. From his position along the wall, his gaze fixed on the tiny details no one else would notice. The clasp was original, an 1860s hinged design no modern jeweller replicated. And there, just visible where the gold met the emerald's bale, was a micro tag, a faint etching, no larger than a scratch, used to mark items catalogued under the Sovereign Legacy Register. He had seen similar tags in training diagrams issued by the Royal Collection Trust. Across the hall, Miss Lawton, the archivist, froze mid-step. Her clipboard pressed tightly to her chest, knuckles white, eyes locked on the emerald, as if she were watching a ghost walk into the room. An equerry's gaze flickered toward the pendant, then darted away again as though burned by the sight, and yet not a word was spoken. At the ministerial table, a Nordic attaché leaned close to his colleague and whispered, "Is that what I think it is?" The other swallowed, nodded slightly and muttered, "It hasn't been seen publicly for decades." Rhys heard it all, though he made no sign. His stance remained the same, rifle at rest, bare skin steady. But inside, his mind sharpened. This was no ceremonial ornament pulled from a jewellery case for sentiment. This was a protected piece. Its very presence here demanded explanation. And yet, protocol bound him. Guards did not break formation for suspicion alone. Unless the law itself required intervention, he was to remain as he was, silent, immovable, part of the furniture of Windsor. Still, as the chandelier light struck the emerald once more, scattering green fire across the hall, Rhys Mallory knew he had just seen the first provocation. The luncheon began to settle into its rhythm, footmen drawing chairs, crystal pouring wine, the string quartet smoothing into a Bach prelude. Yet beneath the music, the air carried a taut undercurrent. Rhys Mallory could feel it the way a soldier feels an ambush before it happens, not in what was loud, but in what was slightly off. A household aide hurried across the floor, juggling name cards and lanyards as though he were herding cattle instead of dignitaries. Rhys's eyes followed the man's hands, not his face, not his flustered expression, but the laminated passes he passed out one by one. Again, he caught sight of the anomaly, the same faint legacy icon embossed in one of the badges. A vault clearance insignia, out of place, out of context. And yet, it hung from the neck of a junior staffer like an afterthought. Rhys said nothing. He simply marked the detail and tucked it away, as he always did. The aide didn't stop there. With a strained smile, he approached the head table, shuffling place cards with the desperation of a man trying to rewrite a script in real time. "Your Majesty, perhaps if we reseat slightly, just for optics with the delegation," he said, gesturing toward an empty chair positioned beneath a display case mounted on the far wall. The case held replicas of royal artifacts, harmless reproductions for the sake of pageantry. Yet the suggestion was clear, a deliberate attempt to centre Camilla directly beneath symbols of heritage. Rhys's jaw tightened, though his body betrayed nothing. From behind the aide, a young footman, barely out of training, whispered to a colleague while adjusting silverware. "They'll transfer it to private custody," he muttered, tone casual. Private custody. The words rang wrong in Rhys's ears. Legacy items were never transferred to private custody. They were held under trust, safeguarded for the crown and the nation. That slip of language wasn't ignorant, it was intent. Rhys's grip on his rifle stiffened, not in readiness, but in discipline. He reminded himself of the box he lived inside. A guard's authority was bounded by protocol. He was not judge nor investigator. His duty was to act only when the line was crossed, and only with measured precision. Outside, storm clouds gathered, pressing dim light through the leaded windows. The chandeliers gleamed harder against the darkening sky as though fighting back the gloom. The hall's grandeur felt less like ceremony and more like a stage where tension was mounting toward an inevitable. The quartet played on, but Rhys no longer heard the music. His eyes were fixed on the emerald glint at the Queen Consort's throat, on the false badge swinging from the aide's neck, on the subtle language that betrayed intent. The trap was tightening, and every instinct told him the moment was coming when stillness would no longer be enough. From his place at the west wall, Rhys Mallory let his eyes sweep the hall one more time before making the smallest of movements, a press of his thumb along the inner side of his rifle stock, where a discreet comms switch lay hidden. The world outside assumed the guards were silent statues, but the truth was different. The uniform hid tools as well as traditions. His voice, low and crisp, carried across a private channel. Confirm visual 041 series. Possible live display. Require ledger status. There was a pause, filled only by the quartet's gentle cadence and the scrape of forks against porcelain. Then Ms. Lawton's voice returned, clipped with urgency. Registry U41F Lockridge pendant. Status non-display, non-transfer. Review date 2070. A beat. Also, system logged a ghost entry last night. Corridor 17, no identity stamp. The words hit like cold steel. Rhys kept his face neutral, but inside the puzzle tightened. A ghost entry meant someone had bypassed vault security. And if the pendant now hung at the Queen Consort's throat, then the unthinkable had already occurred. His eyes locked on the jewel once again. The chandelier light fractured against the emerald, scattering flecks of green across the hall. He noted the internal flaw, a minute feather-shaped inclusion near the base, something he remembered from a training plate shown during legacy orientation. It was no replica. This was the piece itself. Confirm hallmark, Bale etching, he murmured. Matches 1860s assay, Lawton replied. Her voice was taut, every syllable weighed down with alarm. This isn't a misunderstanding, Sergeant. It's breach of legacy protocol. At the head table, Camilla lifted her glass with serene composure, as though the emerald at her throat were nothing more than an accessory. Ministers spoke softly around her, feigning ease but stealing glances they could not suppress. The air was thick with the knowledge that something wasn't right, though no one dared to voice it. Rhys's mind hardened. He now had the triad every guard was trained to seek before breaking silence: reason, visual, verification. Reason, the pendant's protected status. Visual, the unmistakable microtag and flaw. Verification, registry confirmation from the archives. And with that, the weight of duty shifted on his shoulders. Stillness was no longer enough. He inhaled once, steady, grounding himself in the stone and history around him. Every movement from this point would ripple through centuries of tradition. But the oath he had taken, to protect not just monarchs, but the legacy they carried, left no other choice. The next step would break protocol, and once broken, there would be no returning to silence. Rhys Mallory let the breath leave his chest in a single quiet release. Then, with the same precision he had drilled into recruits years ago, he shifted forward one pace from the line of guards at the west wall. The sound was so small, boots scraping stone, that it should have been nothing. Yet in St. George's Hall, the movement cracked like thunder. Every fork stilled. The quartet's bow froze mid-stroke. Ministers glanced sideways, startled to see what they were never meant to see: a Coldstream Guard breaking formation. Rhys's right hand rose, palm angled outward, fingers steady. His voice followed, calm and carrying, the resonance of a soldier trained to be heard over battlefield noise, and invoking Safeguard 12, verification required before proceedings continue. Gasps flitted through the hall like wind through tall grass. Foreign dignitaries exchanged confused looks. Translators bent to whisper. At the head table, Queen Camilla turned slowly, her eyes narrowing on the lone figure in scarlet. "Explain yourself, Sergeant," she said, her tone not loud, but edged with command. Rhys met her gaze without flinching. "The pendant displayed at your neck is catalogued under Legacy Register. Status, non-display, non-transfer. Verification is mandated under law." A diplomat's glass clinked hard against the table, loud in the silence that followed. The king remained perfectly still, neither confirming nor denying, his hands folded before him like a statue carved from the oak panelling. Camilla's lips thinned. "Are you accusing me of theft?" "I am stating procedure, Your Majesty," Rees replied even. Safeguard 12 requires verification by Royal Collection Trust officers and archival ledger, nothing more. The words landed like measured stones, impossible to argue without revealing intent. Rees knew the rules well. He had not accused, had not speculated. He had simply invoked the process that bound him as tightly as it bound the institution. Behind him, the equerry shifted uneasily, then lifted a hand toward a side door. A messenger slipped away at once, no louder than a shadow, to fetch the portable verification case. The silence of the hall held. All eyes were fixed on the scarlet tunic, the bearskin hat, the single figure who had dared to speak. Rees did not fidget, did not break posture. His rifle remained angled, his gaze steady. He was not there to win an argument. He was there to protect a legacy. And by stepping forward, he had drawn the line no one else dared to draw. The side doors of St. George's Hall creaked open, and two figures entered with the solemnity of pallbearers. One carried a slim, velvet-lined case embossed with the crest of the Royal Collection Trust. The other clutched a leather-bound ledger, its edges worn from centuries of hands, its spine gleaming under the chandelier light. Every pair of eyes followed them as they crossed the length of the hall. The quartet had fallen completely silent. The only sound now was the echo of their footsteps, each one marking out the gravity of what was about to unfold. Rees Mallory did not move from his post 1 pace ahead of the guard's line. He watched as the liaison placed the velvet case upon the head table, opening it with a click that seemed to shatter the hush. Inside lay the instruments of verification: a jeweler's loupe, a UV torch, a pair of white gloves, and a cloth of archival silk. "By order of the Safeguard Statute," the liaison said evenly, his voice projecting without flourish, "we will now confirm the status of this item." Camilla's eyes glittered as the emerald pendant was lifted from her neckline. For the briefest instant, she hesitated, her fingers brushing the stone like someone reluctant to part with more than just jewelry. Then, with calculated composure, she unclasped it and placed it in the waiting silk. The loupe came first. The liaison leaned close, peering at the fine gold lattice, tracing the hallmark stamped at the clasp. Assay, London, 1860s, consistent with registry. The UV torch followed. When its beams swept across the emerald, a faint sequence of digits glowed at the bail, invisible to the naked eye. Gasps rippled across the tables. The liaison recited them aloud, then opened the ledger. His finger tracked down a page of fine script until he stopped on the entry. 041F, Lock Ridge. Pendant, non-transferable, non-display. Review scheduled 2070. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Camilla's chin lifted, her expression unyielding. Her late Majesty promised me this privately. It was a matter of family, not institution. Rees's reply was steady, stripped of emotion. "Do you hold written documentation of that assurance, Your Majesty?" The silence that followed was more powerful than any answer. A diplomat coughed into his napkin. The king's gaze did not shift. His face might have been carved in stone. The liaison closed the ledger with a deliberate snap. "Status confirmed. Item is protected under legacy law. Its display constitutes breach until review date." For the first time, even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as if Windsor itself were holding its breath. Rees remained motionless. The verification had spoken. Now, truth itself was on the table. The silence inside St. George's Hall had grown heavy, the kind that presses down on lungs and makes even the strongest feel small. The pendant lay inside the silk cloth, no longer an ornament, but evidence. All eyes were fixed on the Royal Collection liaison as he reached into his case again, this time producing a slim sheaf of papers. "Verification does not end at the object," he said, his voice even but carrying the weight of centuries of law. "Registry protocols extend to access history." He laid the papers flat upon the table. Printed across them were the system's electronic vault logs, stamped with times and door codes. His finger traced down the page to an entry marked in bold red, Corridor 17A, timestamp 2246, identity null, authorization ghost entry. Gasps rippled like a wave through the diplomats. Even those who knew nothing of British protocol understood the implications. Vaults did not open themselves. A ghost entry meant deliberate bypass. Someone had forced the door. The aide, who had been bustling earlier, shifted uneasily, his face pale. A faint plastic edge protruded from his jacket pocket, and Reese's eyes locked on it instantly. The laminated badge. With precise calm, the liaison extended his hand. "Your pass, sir." Reluctantly, the aide produced it. The moment it touched the table, the forgery was obvious. The laminate was too thin, the embedded crest faintly misaligned, and beneath the magnifier, the legacy icon shimmered at the wrong density. The liaison did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This badge does not meet standard. It is an internal forgery. Combined with the ghost entry and this item's display, the attempt meets the statutory threshold for unlawful removal under legacy safeguard." The words landed like a gavel. Unlawful removal. Not accusation of theft, not sensational charge, but the cold, institutional language that transformed whispers into record. Camilla's hand remained on the table, her fingers tightening around her wineglass until the stem trembled. Her eyes swept the room, daring anyone to challenge her authority. "You mistake stewardship for theft," she said icily. "What was promised to me, it is mine." No one moved, no one spoke. Even the king's silence had become a presence of its own, an immovable wall neither defending nor denying, leaving the weight of judgment suspended in the air. Rhys Mallory held his ground, as steady as the stone beneath his boots. He had done what tradition demanded, observed, verified, and revealed. The next step would not be his to decide. But he knew, as surely as he knew the weight of the bearskin on his head, that consequence was coming. And this time, it would not be delayed. The hall had turned into a courtroom without walls. The chandelier light seemed harsher now, striking the emerald where it rested in its silk pouch, no longer a jewel but a verdict. All waited for someone to move, for the silence to break. It was the equerry who finally did. His voice was controlled, clipped, carrying the weight of a decision already sealed. "By order of the royal household and under legacy safeguard, this item will be recovered to custody. Her Majesty will withdraw from the hall." The words fell like stones into still water. Camilla's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening in a faint smile that held no warmth. She reached, slowly, deliberately, for the pendant. For an instant, Rhys Mallory thought she might refuse, might clutch it as a symbol of defiance and force a confrontation no one wanted. But then, with surgical precision, she unclasped her fingers and placed the emerald back into the archival pouch. The liaison closed the silk folds with care, sealing history back into fabric. He snapped the case shut, and the sound rang louder than it should have, like the click of a lock on a cell door. "Escort," the equerry said simply. Rhys did not hesitate. He stepped forward, turned crisply on his heel, and began to walk 3 paces ahead. Kicks out, not with hands or force, but with the steady authority of a guard who had drawn the line and would now see it enforced. Behind him, Camilla rose. Her steps followed his, measured and proud, the echo of her heels on stone, a declaration that though she might yield the pendant, she would not yield her poise. To royal collection. Trust officers fell in alongside her, silent flanks that transformed the procession into a dismissal. The aide trailed behind, face ashen. The forged badge still clutched like a brand that had burned his hand. They moved through the east corridor, away from the diplomats, away from the watching eyes of foreign ministers and staff. The walls here were plain stone, hung with modest tapestries, devoid of grandeur. It was a hallway of transition, where ceremony bled into consequence. Staff paused in their duties as the procession passed. A maid froze mid-sweep. A young footman stepped instinctively aside, bowing without knowing why. No one spoke. No one needed to. At the archway that marked the threshold between Windsor's public grandeur and its private machinery, the equerry raised a hand. "Here!" Rhys stopped, turned to face forward once more, then stepped back into stillness as Camilla crossed the threshold. The doors closed behind her with a muted finality, soft but absolute, the sound of history turning a page. Rhys Mallory returned to his post, the scarlet of his tunic as bright as ever, the tall black bearskin steady above his unflinching gaze. Duty had spoken. When Rhys Mallory stepped back into St. George's Hall, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that words could not capture. The pendant was gone, the Queen Consort escorted away, yet the silence lingered, thick as incense. Ministers, who only moments before had been exchanging polite laughter, now sat stiff in their chairs, eyes fixed on the table, as though unsure whether to eat, speak, or breathe. The string quartet, after an uncertain pause, resumed playing softly. Their bows moved across strings with delicate restraint, filling the void with a music that felt less like celebration and more like benediction. Silverware was lifted again, though hesitantly, every sound now heavy with awareness that they had witnessed something not meant for public eyes. Rhys returned to his position at the west wall, sliding into his stance with seamless precision. To the casual observer, it would appear as though nothing had changed. Just another guardsman, motionless, rifle by his side, bare skin, tall and unwavering. But those who had watched knew better. The room knew better. Across the floor, Ms. Lawton caught his eye. She did not smile or speak, but she inclined her head just slightly, a silent recognition, professional and discreet. It was the kind of acknowledgement that lasted a heartbeat, but carried the weight of gratitude measured in years. Near the guest tables, a young girl from the Nordic delegation glanced up at him. She could not have been more than 8 or 9, dressed in a neat blue dress that matched the sash across her father's chair. Her small hand rose, fingers pressed clumsily together in an attempt at a salute. For the first time that day, Rhys allowed the faintest shift in his bearing. Not a smile, not a gesture, but a subtle dip of his chin. A soldier's nod returned to a child who would likely never forget it. Then he stilled again, his eyes fixed forward, his body fused once more to the stone and oak of Windsor's great hall. The words he had spoken earlier still resonated within him, quiet but firm. Legacy isn't worn to be seen. It's preserved to be remembered. No applause followed. No headlines would emerge. What had been done was not for spectacle. It was for duty, for restraint, for the memory of those who had guarded before him and those who would guard after. And as the music swelled faintly, life inside the hall resumed, carrying on as though nothing had happened, while everyone present knew that everything had. So let me ask you this. Was the guard right to invoke verification in full view of diplomats, knowing exactly who he was confronting? Should private assurances or whispered promises ever outweigh the written laws that protect a nation's legacy? And finally, do you believe jewels like the Lockridge pendant should ever be worn by individuals, or only preserved under the Crown's trust? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you believe tradition and duty should always outrank comfort and convenience, then tap that like button right now. Make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on so you never miss a story like this one. And don't just keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who still thinks royal guards are just silent ornaments outside a palace gate. Today proved otherwise. Your next investigation is already waiting for you on screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another reminder that some legacies aren't worn or claimed, only protected.